we'll get started with our agenda and just a quick overview of the export agencies involved. Since you're a beginner exporter, we wanted to make sure that although we are going to be covering mainly OFAC and OFAC licensing, I wanted to also give you a brief overview of BIS and Ddtc and what these agencies are and what they enforce, because I do see, especially with new exporters, a lot of confusion between the jurisdiction of the agencies, what agency governs what program and things like that. So hopefully, at the very least, this presentation will create some awareness and you'll know what questions to ask and who to go to and things like that. And then if time permits, we do have a lot of material just on that first portion of the presentation. But if we have enough time, we would also have a portion dedicated just to recent developments in the sanctions programs and compliance tips as well. So just a brief overview of the various agencies involved. So we have Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS, and this is the agency that regulates the export administration regulations. And most of you, if you're a new exporter, most of you will be under this agency. They regulate dual-use items. Those are items that are both commercial and could potentially also have a military application. And they also regulate exports of technology and deem exports. For example, if you have a foreign national working on your staff, maybe those foreign nationals, depending on their nationality and the technology involved, could require licenses. So that will be the agency that regulates dual-use items. So in terms of BIS, I mentioned earlier that BIS regulates dual-use items and technology. This agency probably controls 99% of the exports out of the United States because most people are not exporting defense items. But they also have a new list now known as the 600 series items that only regulate military items that transfer under export reform from the ITAR to the CCL. And that triggers some special requirements, especially when exporting to certain countries where we have sanctions or restrictions of defense items. And this agency, in a way, I always say that requires a little more work sometimes, because if you do have items that are CCL control under the Commerce Control List, it may require you to figure out your ultimate destination, the classification of the item, to understand the reasons for control, unlike the ITAR, for example, where the ITAR would likely require licenses for most destinations. With the BIS regulations or the EAR, it depends on the actual classification of the item, where the item is going, the end user, the ultimate end use, for you to figure out if you require a license. So there's a little more reasoning involved with BIS. They also control, as I mentioned earlier, they control deem exports. And that's one area where if you ever run into deem export cases, that will be a situation where you have a foreign national working here in the United States, for example, for your company. Typically, you won't be dealing with OFAC in that case. Typically, you're going to come to BIS for deem export licenses. For example, I had a case recently where we had an Iranian foreign national working on, at a company here in the U.S., and even though OFAC is generally the agency that you go to for Iran-related transactions, for deem export licenses, we also have to get BIS's licensing. So the BIS also has its embargo and special destination requirements, like OFAC. And if you go to Section 15 CFR 746, you'll find all the various countries that are restricted in some way or another. And you'll find that it's actually the same programs as the ones you find in OFAC: Cuba, Iran, North Korea. Now, for the most part, in private practice, I don't get a whole lot of questions with respect to North Korea, Iran, but there have been a lot of recent developments as of lately that would impact non-U.S. persons, and hopefully we'll get some time at the end to discuss some of these recent developments. But if you're exporting items that are subject to the CCL, that are dual-use items, you need to, in addition to checking the OFAC sanctions, you also need to review this portion of the EAR and make sure that you understand it well. Now, the EAR also has its own list. Dave is going to talk to you about the specially designated nationals list under OFAC, but the EAR also has its own list, the denied parties list, entity list, and the unverified end users list. And all of these lists have different meanings. For example, they're not all created equal, in other words. So for example, the denied parties list, it will be individuals that are denied export privileges. So if you wanted to export to someone that is on the denied parties list, you can't. The entity list, however, means that if you find a company there or an individual listed there, they may not receive certain EAR items without a license. So you may be able to get a license for them, even if, for example, the actual product itself wouldn't require a license to that specific destination. If that individual is listed on the entity list, then you may require licenses just based on that designation. And you also cannot ship to entity list individuals under exceptions, so you have license requirements. And the unverified end users list, that's a list that includes parties that the government was unable to verify. So either we don't know who they are, or there's something where we just don't trust them. And again, you cannot send items to these parties without using license exceptions. So you will have to get either a license or double check the transaction to make sure that they're not going to be a party of concern. And also, with unverified end users list, there's a requirement for the exporter to file an AES record for all exports to these parties. So typically, most exports from the United States would require the AES filing. We do see issues, though, where, for example, you don't necessarily require a license based on the product classification. No license based on the country, but if the party is listed under the unverified end users list and the transaction value is less than $2,500, sometimes people forget that this list requires you to do the AES filing regardless, because there's a very well-known exception under the foreign trade regulations that if your shipment is less than $2,500, you don't require the EEI. But for these kinds of users, you would require to have that filing. So sort of something to keep in mind. But again, I always say with BIS and EAR, there's a lot more work involved just because you cannot assume that all the lists are treated the same. There's different requirements for each list if you do actually get a hit. And also because the product itself tells you the reasons for control, and you have to know the ECCN or the classification of the product before deciding or to do the analysis as to whether your item requires licenses. But we also have Department of State and the Ddtc, Directorate of Defense Trade Control. They regulate the international traffic in arms regulations, so those will be shipments or exports of defense items. Now, I get a lot of people that say, well, I definitely don't ship any munitions or anything like that, but there are other items that may not sound or look like they're defense items that could be potentially caught under the international traffic arms regulations. So that's why it's important to cover it. They have their own lists, and they have also certain countries that are not otherwise sanctioned by OFAC or BIS, but that would require, licenses or for you to be careful before you decide to export defense items to those countries. So Ddtc is next, and Ddtc will be for, again, exports of items that are controlled under the USML, the United States Munitions List, under the ITAR. And there are 21 categories, like I mentioned earlier. Not everything looks military-ish, so you have to be careful with things like military electronics. This is less a concern now after export reform because the lists were modified to be more positive. But still, you always need to double check your classifications and your items and understand the differences in jurisdiction. And a lot of the questions regarding classification most of them don't involve OFAC per se. It's a question of, is this USML versus CCL? But it's always important to keep the Ddtc in mind because, well, first of all, you always require, most of the time, unless there's an exemption, and these are very limited, most of the times you will require licenses. So unlike BIS where you have to do the analysis based on the product, ECCN, and all of that, here you can assume that unless an ITAR exemption applies, you will require licenses, even to countries that typically on the EAR side wouldn't require, like Canada. With ITAR, you probably would unless you qualify for an exemption. And then they also have their own list under Ddtc, and I always mention Ddtc because they have their own list of countries for that have arms embargoes. And I had a case that triggered a directed disclosure. So my client hired us after he was actually trying to comply with the law. He was exporting what was back then, this was pre-ECR, but back then it was an ITAR item. And he decided that he wanted to sell it to a company in China. But, you know, they checked China in OFAC, and they were like, okay, there's no, no restrictions, no sanctions program against China, but they neglected to check the Ddtc list. And China has an arms embargo. And if he had gone to 126.1 D1, he would have known that a Chinese license to export to China, no way he was going to get that approved. But not only that, because he submitted the license application, the government sort of doubted the compliance level at that company. So what happened is Ddtc actually ended up doing a directed disclosure. And a directed disclosure is unlike a voluntary self-disclosure where the companies voluntarily tell the government, hey, we have some issues. In a directed disclosure, the government is basically sending you questionnaires, and it's a little more aggressive, and you may not necessarily get the opportunity to do a voluntary self-disclosure at that point that mitigates penalties. So long story short, always very important for new exporters to figure out the classification of the items, because based on that jurisdiction, you know what lists to check and what countries could be potentially prohibited. Another example I have is I had a client that the ITAR is very restrictive, and so they have the see-through rule. And the see-through rule means that even a small component that will be sold, let's say you're going to export your component, and I think I have a question by Dave Clark, but we're waiting for questions at the end, but I will address your question at the end. And where was I? Oh, yeah. So in cases of re-export, so if you have under the see-through rule in the ITAR, if you're selling your item, even if it's a minor component that it's going to be incorporated into an end use, a different end item abroad, if that end item is later retransferred, let's say, to China, then that would trigger ITAR violations. So it's very important to always keep in mind, see-through rule with ITAR, jurisdiction, because a lot of these other countries may be triggered that you wouldn't ever hear under the OFAC. And the reason I started talking about this see-through rule was because I had a client that was re-exporting, not them, but they were selling to a distributor in Mexico that was incorporating these minor components into aircraft or larger part. It wasn't the full aircraft, but it was like parts of an aircraft, and they were reselling those to Venezuela. Well, my client didn't know that we also have an arms embargo against Venezuela. So again, that would be a prohibited transaction. So always double check 126.1 D1 if you're a defense exporter. 126.1 D2 has other countries that have a policy of denial, but there may be some exceptions, so you may be able to get licenses. And then, of course, we have Department of Treasury, OFAC, which we're going to cover in a lot of detail today. and they regulate the U.S. sanctions regulations. And typically, OFAC was the agency that was regulating, think of some of the enforcement actions were big banks, money transactions, more so than your typical exports of items. But as of lately, the agency is also now targeting more of the regular exporters, more so than before anyway. The OFAC, which Dave is going to cover in a lot more detail than I will, they administer and enforce economic and trade sanctions based on U.S. foreign policy and national security goals against either foreign countries, terrorists, international narcotics traffickers, and others. A good way of sort of thinking about the agencies is BIS and Ddtc regulate product or technology export, more so than activities by U.S. persons per se. The OFAC regulates U.S. person activities, transactions involving financial transactions, and those kinds of transactions wouldn't necessarily be covered under the other regulations. But if you are a new exporter and you're sending products abroad, you have to be mindful of all three regulations and figure out what applies to your product. And they will cover this in more detail, but OFAC has list-based sanctions, which will be those sanctions that target specific entities or persons. For example, in the case of Russia, we don't have an arms embargo against Russia per se, but we have different individuals that have been designated as special designated nationals that we cannot do business with. And they also have the country-based sanctions, which are against the entire country and the nationals of that country. And those are like the ones that you probably have heard about in the news, like Cuba, Iran, where we're pretty restricted from conducting any type of business with those countries.